Well, this is a great honor for me to replace a far more distinguished speaker. I'm sorry for you that it's me, but I'm happy to do it. And I want to follow along with one of the previous speakers to address regulation and to investigate why deregulation is so difficult. We're going to look at regulation from the perspective of a voluntary regulation versus a state regulation. And I think that most people tend to think of regulation as the domain of the government, but without realizing that, in fact, much of the regulation of our lives comes through voluntary market processes. Okay, so that's my general theme. Now, I'm going to start with a proposition. Civilization, in many ways, is really the human search for some kind of order. In ancient times, that order was somewhat violent. It was based upon violence. And as we have progressed as human beings, we've moved towards a system that is trying to create social harmony. Now, again, we had very bad outcomes in the early 20th century, mid to late 20th century, with the various revolutions in China and in Russia, where their ideal of social harmony was oppression. But generally, what we find is that these things are not stable because they don't address basic human needs. So what we're looking for, and I think this is what we're seeing in Argentina today, they're trying to find out how can we live our lives in a way that where we're more or less free. We're free but responsible. That is, I can do what I wish as long as I don't harm you. And we want to protect human dignity, personal dignity. So these are very important aspects of human life. And in the end, as I'm an economist, we also find that this is a way to generate economic efficiency, so we can have more prosperity, we can have a diminished poverty, and so on. So these rules that would guide our action can either be based upon state control, state dictate, state requirements, state coercion. So their ability to impose these regulations on us is political power. So political power is really the most threatening aspect of human life, because political power is very hard to contest. You had many years of peronistas and kirchneristas and many different varieties. Many countries have had to suffer for quite a long time, because that political power is hard to get back from people. And our friend Javier is trying to take those steps for all of you and for the rest of us. Coming here is an inspiration. I've been coming since 1999 and seeing sort of, more or less continuation of the same old thing for most of that time until the election of Milei. So the other alternative is voluntary self-regulation based on cooperation. And we don't really give that as much emphasis when we're trying to think about what regulation is all about. Because much of our life is regulated based upon these agreements. Now, when it comes to the political process, we have to worry about some elite deciding, so the Kirchners, or whoever it may be, deciding for the rest of us how we should live our lives, and how we should live our lives together in a group. And this is problematic, because they are suffering from what Friedrich Hayek would say, the fatal conceit. They believe that they know what is best for us, and we are supposed to simply abide by it. Now, on the other hand, when it comes to the voluntary process, we decide in a decentralized manner how we live our lives together. And again, the important aspect of human freedom is accountability or responsibility. That I'm accountable for how I act. And so if I commit fraud or if I commit aggression against you, I'm held accountable for that. So this allows people to plan their own life instead of some government elite circumscribing or limiting or directing your life. Now, so what we have then is that when we have the elite in control, the government decides what the rules are, and of course, because governments have the monopoly on the legal use of violence, they're able to push us in directions that we may not want to go. And in fact, this is the primary cause, I think, of poverty, is that governments are exercising so much control, regulating too much, creating high tax burdens, and so on. Now, on the other hand, if we have voluntary rules that we sort of understand that there are limits to what we can do, and we choose on that basis to live with one another. And this is where the market process comes in. Markets are a self-regulating system. So this is why people are either anarchists or minarchists. They say, well, we don't need so much government. Or some would say we don't need government because left to our own devices, we will find a way to peacefully live with one another. So the one thing that we find when the elite is involved with setting political or government regulation, they tend to make non-economic choices. They try to drive the risk to zero. But if you drive the risk of life to zero, it comes at a very high cost. And one of those costs will be freedom. But often it's very high as a monetary cost. So this is one aspect of the failing of political regulation, of government regulation. So what we find is that once you get closer and closer to zero, those risks will go up asymptotically. So you can make a movement towards zero, but the closer you get to zero, the much, much higher cost will occur. So what we're looking for then is a sort of an optimal level of regulation or an optimal level of rules that include both cost and benefits. Most of the time, if you listen to politicians, what they're promising you is benefits. And they either do not mention costs or they ignore costs. Or they expect you to. So this is another core problem with government regulation. So again, we'll summarize this again. What we have with the state-imposed regulation, we're regimented. You know, we're treated as though we are homogeneous in our tastes, our preferences, our life purposes, our future. As opposed to voluntary regulation, which is based on voluntary agreement, as I mentioned. Now, if we consider the approaches or compare them in terms of efficiency, governments and government officials have very weak accountability. Elections are periodic, 2 years, 4 years, 6 years, whatever. So it's very hard to make a politician or political figure accountable. Bureaucrats, generally in most countries, cannot be fired, even for incompetence or whatever, waste. So what we know that because of this lack of accountability, that we can expect that the kind of regulations that they would impose upon us will be very inefficient. And in other words, will have more costs than benefits. Now, when it comes to efficiency, the market is all about incentives. Incentives create a payoff or a penalty. A payoff if you are conserving resources, you might make profits. Penalties if you waste resources, then you're going to, perhaps in a business, be bankrupt. But accountability is much greater in a market setting than it is in the political setting. Now, if we consider morality or moral frameworks, if you consider this, any act that you take that is based upon being forced to do so cannot be a moral act. A moral act is one that you choose to do so because you believe it is right or wrong according to your own moral standards. But when the government requires it, you're not making a choice. You're not considering the morality. So, this is lacking. But of course, what politicians are very good at is trying to pretend that they are making a moral decision on your behalf. And they expect you to reward them accordingly. When it comes to voluntary acts, as I say, only when you are choosing to do what you do because it's based upon your understanding of right and wrong can you decide that it's moral or immoral. So, citizens may be forced to commit immoral acts because the politicians or political governance requires it. So, in a way, you're less culpable, you're less to blame if you're forced to do something that is going against your moral choices. Left to your own devices, you would probably say no. Now, in terms of justice, political governance is not based upon justice. It's not the first thing that they consider. When they are deciding to regulate your life, they don't ask themselves if doing so leads to an improvement in justice or is an injustice. They don't care. They have their own sort of reasoning that would guide them. But it's almost never based upon any kind of sense of justice. So what happens, democracy, as we know it today, has become a game of redistribution. It's not about morality, it's not about justice, it's not about private property. It's about how to get the most votes, and you do that by promising one group you'll take away from the other group to give to them. Now, modern democracy was never meant to be about redistribution. It was meant to be about personal liberty, about private property. That's why the founding fathers in the Gringos and then in Alberti, the people that were the early thinkers about democracy, they wanted to see, how can we deliver human liberty? How can we protect private property? But most politicians don't care about that anymore. They care about being elected or re-elected. And the way to do that is through redistribution. So, in the end, they commit injustices, knowingly. They act immorally, in my view, immorally. So, the idea that we can look in the political sphere for either justice or morality is an illusion. Although, again, they would have us believe that. Now, in the market process, where we have voluntary arrangements, we're generally guided by what we could call the rule of law, Estado de Derecho. And what this means is that the purpose is to allow people to be free, to protect their private property, and to provide the basis for prosperity through everyone being treated equally. This is the essence of the rule of law. It's the equal treatment of every citizen, regardless of their gender, regardless of their wealth or income, regardless of their position in society. We're all meant to be treated equally. And this has been lost to a considerable degree. So we find that politicians expect us to stand up when they enter the room, to applaud them if they come into the restaurant. No, they work for us. Politicians are our servants. We should not be considering ourselves to be their servants. I don't stand up for politicians when they come in the room. Actually, I was at a gathering where Bill Clinton was then president. They played the music, and he entered the room. Everyone stood up, but me. And of course, the Secret Service, well, the Secret Service positioned themselves behind me for the rest of the dinner. But I don't stand up for national anthems. I'm sorry. Why should I? So, anyway, when we look at how states regulate us, I mean, and again, this is unfortunately why deregulation becomes difficult, because people say, well, if the state doesn't do it, what's the alternative? Well, I've given you the alternative. Market processes, individual decisions, moral behavior, rule of law. We have that. But anyway, so once again, we live in a world where the political power allows these individuals, bureaucrats, politicians, political parties, to impose on us rules that just a few of them decided upon. I mean, you know better than I do in this country how that has played out, where we had Perón following the fascist agenda, and it became sort of laundered and softened, and it began to be some other things. But in fact, Evita and all these, I mean, they had all these grand ideas for what you must do with your own money, but as if it was their money they're giving back to you or whoever they selected to. So at its heart, the reason we go along with that is that we're coerced. We feel like we don't have a choice. So when we have state-imposed regulations, they're static. They're very difficult to contest. They don't change very often. They're backward-looking. That is, they say, well, this is our experience. Based upon those experiences, these are the rules. They don't generally provide forward-looking rules. They're inflexible. The central plans of the communist countries or fascist countries. You didn't like what the outcome was? Well, that's too bad. That's the plan. You have to fit in with the plan. They're complex. It's very difficult to know what the intentions are of this political elite because they have these complex ideas about how they're planning the economy or directing your life and so on. Now, so the state-imposed legislation is really based upon, very often it's not ideology. I mean, your country is not driven by ideology. It's driven by populism. Populism doesn't have an ideology, except that they want power and they want resources. They get more power, you have less freedom. They get more resources, you have less. So it's probably better to think of these as political goals or populism per se. There I go. So one element of political governance is protecting themselves. They want to perpetuate, and maybe it's a political party, or maybe it's their own term of office, but it's all about sort of freezing the local conditions for, they're giving me 5 minutes because they gave you a coffee break of 20 minutes extra, but that's okay. So they're insensitive to, you have to comply. They don't care. You say, I'll go bankrupt. I don't care. It's a rule. So these are difficulties. Regulatory capture is a part of the problem, so that special interest groups will be able to direct the regulations to benefit them or to harm their competitors. And there's a tendency for, look at what's happened with the political power, even in this country. I mean, again, the modern era, in a sense, can be seen to begin with Perón. but how much has political power expanded over that time? And again, you accepted it. You didn't resist it the way that Millet and his supporters are now. So, now in terms of the private response, it's evolutionary. You have new information and you change your mind. So this is a possibility in a market process. It's forward-looking. You're saying, well, how's this going to affect my life? It's your individual choice. It's flexible. You're going to adjust to changing conditions. It's simple. I want to live a better life. I want my family to have a better set of conditions. So whenever we have voluntary action based on cooperation, it is exposed to experiences so that we make these adjustments. And it's only us that are directly affected, or maybe our family. So there's an incentive for us to make a correction when we make mistakes. One of the things, politicians don't care about their reputation. They can make promises, they lie all the time. They tell one group one thing or tell another group another thing. But if you try that in the marketplace, your reputation is what makes or breaks you in the market. So that's a very important regulating aspect of markets, is reputation. Brands, for example. Media reporting. Now, how objective is the media about political governance? Now, they excuse them. Certainly now in the United States, the media is supporting expansions of political power, unapologetically. But we read all the time about market excesses. The media will be very critical of some things that will go wrong in the market, but they will be much less critical of what's going on in our capitals. Now, it turns out that there actually, is anybody here a scuba diver? Who regulates scuba diving? The government? PADI. It's a private group. So, and scuba diving is very dangerous. It's very risky. But it's in the hands of a private group that takes care of the people because they care about their reputation. They know that if you see PADI, you know that you can probably trust the person who's providing that scuba equipment. So there's lots of possibilities that, and again, we sort of discount that, even though you may, as a scuba diver, realize that. But this is a self-regulating, voluntary arrangement that doesn't need the state. Now, economic power is almost an oxymoron. Nokia had enormous economic power until it didn't. General Motors had enormous economic power, and now it doesn't. But look what happens to political power. It stays with us. It's very hard to get rid of it. Market power dissipates. It's contested. Technology makes it not valuable any longer. So this is another one of the very important differences. Well, okay, let me go quickly through this. Of course, you know about central planning, so that we have inspections. Of course, they were talking about the watermelons in the previous talk, prohibitions. So what are the costs of regulation? Well, there's the administrative costs. That's the bureaucrats and their pensions, offices, and so on. And in the U.S., it's roughly, in a way, it's not that great. When you look at the compliance costs, they tend to be much, much heavier because it affects all of us, or all whoever's in that regulated activity. So that, for example, the compliance costs in the U.S. are almost $2 trillion compared to, well, it's peanuts, the administrative costs, compared. So these indirect costs impact upon market decisions because the regulations raise the costs or decrease the availability or whatever, so that creates distortions. But we also lose liberty. We lose our freedom through these regulations, government regulations, that is. So, somehow this is messed up, but anyway, so actually, if we think of regulation from the standpoint of human beings, this is, for me, the only objective element in my life is humanity. Society, it's a conception. The state, it's a conception. It's an abstraction. It's an invention. We're trying to aggregate something. What are we trying? We're trying to aggregate ourselves. Well, even though we are like-minded, some of you are anarchists, some are anarcho-capitalists, some are minarchists, some are classical liberal, some of you, God help you, are conservative. But we have sort of some overlapping. But we can't aggregate this group. I mean, we say we're libertarians. I don't know what you say you are. I'm a human being. I think when we try to aggregate humans or any kind of social measure, we're really on very unstable ground, so that we need to be very careful about that. So governments they don't really care about us. It's a rule. And if you break it, you go to jail, perhaps, or they take away your property. Voluntary regulations. Again, people will say, well, it's inappropriate. Let's change it, right? So you have that possibility. So if they're not like Patty, maybe they have a certain standards. Maybe they don't meet the standards of the scuba divers. They'll change them. They'll make them more, they'll adjust to the needs of the user. And when governments are involved, again, inflexible. Markets tend to be more flexible. And governments always tell you that what they're doing is for your good and there's only benefits. But they never tell you who pays for it. And you pay for it either through taxation or through price inflation, which you've had terrible experience with, or some other loss of freedom. In the private sector, we find that there's incentives to be very careful about the impact of rules. And there's a tendency for governments to find the lowest possible risk, even if it comes at very high marginal cost. Whereas in the private sector, we look for cooperative arrangements. Okay, thank you. I went over, but thanks very much.